Okay, I'm going to start with a basic Blender scene as if you just installed it. First off, we're going to delete the camera, the light, and the cue. You do that by right-clicking on them and hitting the X key. Next, I'm going to Scene Settings over there on the right, setting everything to Metric. Scene Settings is there. It's the one that looks like a cylinder, a sphere, and a little light. Next, I'm creating a circle. I don't really want a circle. I want an octagon, so I'm going to set it to be a circle with 8 vertexes, which is an octagon. I'm going to make sure its location is 0, 0, 0. I'm going to set its rotation to 22.5 degrees on the z-axis so that I get a flat face oriented with the x and y axes instead of a vertex. That way it's easier to attach RCS later on, or ladders, wind up with a pod's door, that sort of thing. I have to forgive me if I get some keystrokes wrong here because I'm doing the narration afterwards. The house wasn't calm while I filmed this. So I'm extruding that circle on down by selecting the circle of lines with Alt and then hitting E. I'm going to Alt and right click to select, and I hit F to make a face on the bottom. We'll do the same on the top. Alt and right click to select the whole circle, the whole ring, then hit F to make a face. There's your basic can. Now I'm going to select 4 faces and add some detail to them by tapping E to extrude them, then S to scale them, and I'm going to tap Z after I tap S, so I'm only scaling in the Z dimension. See how they got shorter up and down, but did not change their left and right size? Because they're on facing different directions, so they would have scaled differently. So I'm going to do the opposite pairs and scale them, 2 of them the X direction and 2 in the Y, just by tapping SX or SY. If you tap the wrong one, it's no problem. As you see, I go the wrong direction here and then realize it and tap the other key, whichever one I hadn't just tapped, X or Y. And then I'm typing 0.5 and hitting Enter. I could wiggle them until it looked right, but I'm just typing 0.5. That way it's easier to do both sets identically. So there's your basic lander can, or lower stage. Going to the bottom, I hit E to extrude, and I didn't go anywhere. I just hit E, then Enter. Then I hit S. What I did was created the extra geometry, and then I shrunk the geometry down. Then I extrude again up into the center there. I'm going to hit S again to change the size of that. First I'm going to drag it with the blue arrow, but then S to change it. So select that polygon, and I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Shift D. Then I'm going to hit P, or Alt P, to create a new object by selection. So I move that duplicate polygon to a new object. Tap S and scale it down. This is going to become our engine nozzle. E and extrude it out. Typed E then Z, the Z to lock the extrusion to the Z axis. And just wiggle the blue arrow there until I get what I want as far as position. I'm going to go ahead and set the faces to smooth. You did that under shading UV. You select the faces by typing A to hit everything. And then smoothing, you can see how they now are rounded instead of it being an octagon. It is a kind of a lumpy circle because 8 isn't a lot of vertexes for a circle. I'm just going to continue extruding and scaling E and S. Extrude creates a new ring of polygons on the end of the old chain. And then S and drag it into place. And here I'm using the edge loop feature. I believe that's Control R. It just cuts a set of faces and creates new geometry in the middle. So I created a new set of two lines, create two new sets of faces, and then I extruded them, and then I scaled them. I'm going to do it again. So it's Control R, get the purple line where you want it, Control R, click, and then click again to set it. Then Alt, switch to face mode here, and then Alt click, Alt right click that is, extrude, then scale. And I've added these little rounded ridge details to my engine. Switch to object mode so you can see it rounded, shaded. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to create a jettisonable shroud that protects the engine while it's on the stack. I'm going to select this ring of edges, and because of how I constructed them, Alt and right click didn't select the ring, so I just select them manually. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate them, and then Alt P to move them to their own object, the duplicate to its own object. Then E and Z to extrude it straight down. There you go. Make sure it covers the engine. Then I can hit E, and what I should have hit was E and Enter and not wiggled around, so I go back and do that. And then S. I also should have made it deep like that, but I didn't. And in fact, there's some situations when I got it in game where I can see underneath it, which I wish I couldn't. So should have made this shroud thicker. But now I hit the plus in the 3D view window up there in the top right. I'm going to go down to shading and enable backface culling. KSP only renders the front side of every polygon, so if you have the polygon facing away from you, it's transparent. You can see through the body of the fuel tank there, which is unacceptable. First off, I'm going to fix the shroud because I'm working on it. I'm going to extrude it up, so just E and Z. Take it on up so you can't see through it and underneath it. Now I'm going to select the main can option, and here under shading UVs, there's a recalculate normals button. That usually makes a pretty good guess as to what's on the outside and what's on the inside. If it fails, you can use the flip direction button right below recalculate normal. You just select the polygons you want to flip, and you flip them to do it manually, but I always try to recalculate first, because if it saves me 5 minutes of selecting all the polygons, that's great. Now we're going to just go ahead and start UV unwrapping it. So I set the bottom half of the window here to be a UV image editor. I create a new image, under image, 1024 by 1024 color grid. Okay, that gives us a reference image that as we map it on, we'll be able to see distortion very quickly and see what parts are next to what parts. So I'm going to select the object, all the polygons on it, and click unwrap. And in order to see it up there, I've got to change my rendering mode to texture. There we go. You can see it's pretty weird. The top looks great, even though you're never going to see the top in flight. The bottom's got all these trapezoids, there's a lot of distortion on the angled sides. Not useful, so I select the next option down, which is the Smart UV Unwrap, which gives us something we can actually use. You could totally just export that atlas right there and texture it. But things are a little squished, and since I'm making a tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and do it by hand so you can see me do it. So first I do the top. I select just that polygon, go up into the window U and to unwrap, and select the unwrap option, and I drag it out of the way. Now I'm going to do the 4 flat faces. You can see them selected down there in the image editor. UV unwrap, which is U, and then select the first option in the menu. Now, things can share space on the image, and in fact should. If two things need the same texture, you should just put them in the same place on the image and only use that pixel of the texture once instead of duplicating something. Because texture space is really valuable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack these 4 faces up on top of each other. I'm going to move it coarsely, then I'm going to zoom in and do a better job of it. You obviously want your texture image to be as small as possible, so it takes up as little RAM as possible in KSP, which means you want to use every pixel of it to the best of your ability to get the most detail for the least impact in memory. This tutorial is sure not going to be a tutorial on how to properly atlas a texture. In fact, I'm not going to do a very good job because I'm just going to do this in a hurry. There's going to be plenty of wasted space here that ideally you wouldn't do in the future. Let's move on to the trapezoidal faces here. So I'm going to select them all. And in the main window, hit U and then select unwrap, and there you go. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to stack these 4 on top of each other. Now I missed something here as I'm doing it. I think all these trapezoidal faces are going the same direction. But of the 4 flat faces, a couple of the sides are upside down from the other sides. I didn't notice that as I was doing this, but if I were making a part for release, I would totally go back and fix that. You just select those faces, and then down here in the bottom in the UV image editor, you click the UV button, and there's a flip vertically option, or mirror vertically. I'm not sure. I don't remember what it's called exactly there, but just click one click to do it. All right, we'll go ahead and do the bottom. I used Smart UV Project there, and it turned out pretty good, nice and flat. That'll be easy to texture. Bottom center. I'm just dragging everything out of the way after I wrap each piece. I'm going to arrange them on the image later. By later, I apparently mean now. You want to arrange these pieces to use up as much of the image as possible, and you want to give as much weight to the most important, most visible, most detailed parts that you can. So for example here, we're going to use a lot more space per meter of model for the sides that are out and facing the user during most of their flight than we would for the top and bottom, because they're less important. And you'll see that in a little bit. At the moment, I'm just kind of getting it all in here. Now I'm watching myself zoom in and out, wondering what I got distracted by while I was filming this. We're going to go ahead and unwrap the shroud. We'll come back to keeping the atlas adjusted once we have all the pieces there. Now if I just select it and unwrap, I get that, where it's flattening out the sides as if you'd stepped on this thing, and you see all that distortion around the edges. That would be a pain to texture smoothly. So we're going to do something better. I'm going to select this edge, switching to edge selection mode, selecting one edge, and under UV shading, I'm going to go to Mark Scene. That just tells it, hey, cut this here when you unwrap it. So instead of flattening it out by squishing it, it takes it off as if it were a piece of tape wrapped around it. You can see there, you've got a nice flat ring at the bottom of our image there. That's going to be perfect. We'll do the same thing for the inside here in a second. But first I do the bottom, even though I'm going to come back and do it in a better way in a second. There we go. I have one face of the outside selected there, so I'm going to renew my selection there. I'm just going to drag it down on top of, well, in a minute I'm going to drag it down on top of its brethren there. Apparently managed to get one polygon out of place, so I'm going to redo the outside really quick. Just Alt and right click to select, and U and click unwrap to unwrap it. Now I'm going to drag the inside down on top of the outside so they can be textured together. And now I'm going to do something not dumb about the lip here. I'm selecting it with an Alt and right click. I'm going to hit U, and I'm going to show you light map first, but then what I'm actually going to use is the follow active quads, which just follows the ring of quads around the ring and gives us something we can work with. And I'm going to squish that down, change its aspect ratio. I'm tapping S, and I'm using X and Y to tell it which direction I want to scale. If I only want to scale one direction at a time. And you do that just like when you were tapping E and Z to extrude on the Z axis. You tap S, X, and suddenly you're scaling on just the X axis. I'm not trying to make this a tutorial where we cover everything in Blender, but I'm trying to tell you everything I do so that as you're following along, you'll know what to look up. and working on the engine. First, I just do a smart UV project just to see. Sometimes it just gives you great results, but on this item I knew it wasn't going to. You can see where it cuts it out into separate fans there and creates a bunch of individual rings, and it would just be a nightmare to try and texture that. So we have to do it one ring of edge loops at a time. Without marking a seam, again, we get that stepped on look. So let's mark a seam, and then you can unwrap it. And instead you get a nice banana shape that you can actually deal with. I'm dragging all but one quad there, so I'm going to undo and reselect, and there we go. Now we got it all. I'm just going to do this in fast motion, so I'm just going to use the same technique. I'm going to mark, seam, and unwrap all of these things, and then we're going to arrange them, and I'm going to speed the video up for a second and stop narrating, because you don't have to hear me say over and over again, and right click and unwrap. Okay, so we've got it all unwrapped here. You can see I unwrapped each of those ridges together, so I got the faces joined together there. I'm going to overlap them, I'm going to shrink them down. I'm going to arrange it into a more efficient pattern with the bananas nestled inside each other and the circles on top. The idea is that the ridges will be one texture, the outside of the bell, which are the fatter bananas there, the upper bananas, will be one texture, and the inside of the nozzle is going to be a different texture. By different texture, I mean different look applied to it. It's all going to be in the same texture image. KSP requires that each object only have one texture image for the Blender object and one shader for that. Now what I did there is I joined all the pieces together. I right-clicked in object mode on two pieces and hit Control-J, and then on two pieces and hit Control-J. Now they're all one object, so I can view them all in UV space here on the bottom together and lay out the atlas for everything at once. On really complicated models, it can be a pain to join them, but it's pretty easy to separate them back because it doesn't merge the vertexes. They remain separate individual points, not connected. So we can always go back in, as you'll see me do in a little bit, right-click one polygon, hit Control-L to select everything that's linked to it, and then hit Alt-P to split it off into its own object. Now you see I finally realized the top and bottom were less important than the sides, so the sides are getting more texture space than the top and bottom, even though the sides take up less space on the model. Just tapping the G key to move these things, by the way. I haven't mentioned that keystroke, but that is how you move things. Select some of it and hit Control-L. That selects everything that's linked to it. Drag it down. And again, this is not going to be an efficient atlas at all because I wasn't trying to take the time on that. I just wanted to get a part into KSP and working. I realized that some of those were upside down, so I rotated them. Let's tap R and then type 180 to rotate it 180 degrees. There you go. That's the basic texture atlas. Next, you're going to go down to the bottom to UV and select Export UV Layout. And that's going to give you a PNG image that you can put into Photoshop in the next portion of the tutorial. But before we do cover that tomorrow, I'm just going to look at the last couple of things we're going to do in Blender. One is separate these items back out. Just as I said earlier, I'm editing the main object. I'm selecting one polygon of the thing I want to split out, and hitting Alt-P, and then clicking by selection, and that splits it into its own object. So I've separated the shroud again. I'm renaming these things now that they're in their permanent objects. So we'll have lander lower and the shroud. I'm not going to separate the engine back out. There's no reason it needs to be a separate object. I just kept it separate for modeling and texturing reasons. The fewer objects you actually wind up with, the fewer draw calls the game is going to make, and the faster it's going to run. So you want to minimize that in the end. But for modeling purposes, don't be worried about keeping these split up. Sometimes it's easy to be able to grab all of something without having to sit there and spend all day right-clicking on individual polygons. Now I'm going to create in object mode. I'm creating an empty, which is just what it sounds like. It's a point that has a name and a spot and a location, but doesn't have any geometry attached to it. I'm going to duplicate it, Shift-D, and drag that down. So I'm positioning them at 0, 0, 0, which is the top of the can, and 0, 0, something else, which is going to be the bottom of the can. In Unity, we're going to turn these into the attachment nodes, the green balls that show up in the editor that allow you to click parts together. Orientation will be important later, but instead of trying to memorize what Blender orientation equates to what Unity orientation, I'm just going to rotate them in Unity. I'll show you how to do that when we get to the Unity portion in a couple of days. So there should be our complete model split into the parts that need to exist with two empty game objects at the top and the bottom. The last thing we're going to do here is create the collision mesh. Unity needs to know what the boundaries of the object are to attach things to it and to know when it's slammed into things. And you want this mesh to be as simple as possible because it's a real burden on CPU and memory. So I'm selecting the outside of the can here, those 24 polygons in the top. I'm going to hit Shift-D to duplicate them into a new object, or to duplicate them, and then Alt-P to make that duplicate into a new object. Just like we've done a couple of times. You can see it there as lander_lower.001. We'll rename to something that tells us it's a collision. These names used to be really important to the way KSP handled collision meshes. They're not anymore. You can name it anything you want. And I'm going to hide the main can, look at just the collision mesh. I'm going to select the bottom ring and make a face, which isn't wholly necessary because Unity is going to make it convex anyway. But I like having closed meshes. There you go. That's the collider that's going to sit inside our model. It's not going to be rendered or seen, but it's going to tell KSP, hey, there's an object there. That just about wraps up the Blender portion. We'll pick up tomorrow and we'll cover how we put a texture on it in Photoshop.